There is a listing you have all seen. Residential proxies for a price so low it makes the big providers look like daylight robbery. Real residential, it says, rotating, unlimited, a tiny fraction of what everyone else charges. And every time I have given in to that temptation over the years, the same story plays out. So today, instead of telling you not to buy the cheap stuff, I want to walk you through exactly what shows up when you do, why it happens, and how you can check any cheap proxy yourself before you trust a single account to it. A note on how I am doing this. I am not going to name a specific seller and call them a fraud, partly because it would be unfair to single one out when the pattern is the whole market, and partly because the listings come and go under new names every week. What I can tell you is the consistent pattern, the thing that shows up again and again when the price is too good, drawn from actually buying at the cheap end more times than I would like to admit. Treat it as the composite truth, not one story. Here is the plan. First, the bait and why that price is mathematically impossible for real residential. Then what actually arrives when you pay. Then the tells you can check the moment you get access. Then the hidden cost that makes cheap the most expensive option. And finally, how to test anything before you trust it. Then the bait. Real residential bandwidth has a real cost because somewhere a real person's home connection is being used to carry your traffic, and that access has to be paid for up the chain. The legitimate providers price around that cost, which is why genuine residential is never cheap. So when a listing offers real rotating residential for a tiny fraction of the going rate, you do not need to test it to know something is wrong. The maths does not work. Nobody buys bandwidth at one price and sells it for a tenth of that out of generosity. The cheapness itself is the information. Let me put real numbers on why that maths breaks, without naming anyone. A real home connection has a real upstream cost. The person whose line is being used pays their internet provider every month, and whoever resells that connection has to make the resale worth the wear, the risk, and the support burden of routing strangers through someone's house. That is why the honest providers all land in roughly the same price band per gigabyte. They are not colluding. They are all paying the same underlying cost for the same scarce thing. So when one listing sits at a fraction of that band, it is not a smarter business model, it is a different product. There is no clever sourcing trick that lets one seller buy the same home bandwidth for a tenth of what everyone else pays and still turn a profit. The gap is too big to be efficiency. The only way the number works is if the thing being sold is not what the label says, and that is the quiet tell hiding in plain sight before you have spent a cent. So what actually arrives? In my experience, it is almost always one of three things wearing a residential label. The first is data center or static IPSEs dressed up as residential, server addresses from a hosting company that are not residential at all, which any decent target spots instantly. The second is recycled, burned residential, real home EPs technically, but ones that have been hammered by 1,000 other buyers and are already flagged everywhere that matters. And the third is a tiny shared pool, a handful of EPs that the seller has oversold to hundreds of customers, so you are fighting everyone else for the same burned addresses. Let me take those three apart because each one fails you in its own way. The data center swap is the most common and the most insulting because it is the easiest to detect and they sell it anyway. You are handed addresses that belong to a hosting company. The same kind of range any anti-fraud system has flagged as commercial for years, and the listing still says residential. The second archetype, the burned pool, is sneakier because the addresses really are home connections. So a quick check looks fine, but they have been resold so many times to so many people that the major targets already distrust them. You are renting an address with a criminal record. And the third, the oversold pool, is the one that feels worst in daily use. The seller advertises a huge number but hands the same few hundred addresses to everyone, so every customer is hammering the same IPs at once. The success rate swings wildly by the hour, and you never once get a clean address that is yours alone. Now the tells, the things you can check within minutes of getting access. The first and easiest is to look up what the IP actually is. Run it through any IP type or ASN lookup and read who owns it. If it comes back as a hosting company or a known data center network, you were sold data center, full stop, regardless of what the listing said. Real residential comes back as a consumer internet provider, a home broadband or mobile carrier name, and be specific about what you are reading in that lookup because this is the single most useful 10 seconds in the whole process. You are looking for the ASN, the autonomous system number, which is basically the name on the deed of the network the address lives on. A genuine residential IP comes back owned by a consumer internet provider, the kind of name an ordinary person would have on their home bill. A fake one comes back owned by a hosting or cloud company, or an ASN you can search in seconds and find listed all over the place as a known data center range. You do not need a tool you pay for. Cast the address into any free IP type checker, read the owner and the ASN, and the promise either matches a real consumer network or it does not. The second tell is to point it at your real target and watch what happens. Burned and data center IPs fail almost immediately on anything that checks. You get blocks, captchas, and bans straight away. On a target the good providers handle fine. You do not need a fancy benchmark. The failure is obvious and it is fast. The third tell is to check the same address twice with a gap between to see if you actually get a stable session or whether it is rotating randomly under you with no control. And the fourth is to look at the dashboard itself, because the cheap end is usually a thin reseller skin sitting on top of someone else's API with no real controls, no real support, and a contact that goes quiet the moment you have a problem. A little more on each of those, because the details are what save you. When you point it at your real target, you are not running a stress test. You are watching for an instant wall. A good residential IP loads the page like an ordinary visitor. A burned one throws a block or a captcha on the first or second request before you have done anything that should look suspicious, which tells you the address was distrusted before you ever touched it. The stickiness check is just as simple. Ask for the same address, wait a moment, ask again, and see whether you actually hold the session you were promised, or whether the pool is shuffling addresses under your feet, which quietly breaks anything that needs a login or a cart. And the dashboard tells you who you are really dealing with. The honest providers expose real controls, a place to pick a region, set a session length, see your usage. The thin reseller skin has none of that. A couple of buttons over somebody else's API, and a support contact that answers fast while you are buying and goes silent the day something breaks. Here is the part people miss, the real cost. The cheap proxy does not save you money. It just moves the cost somewhere you were not looking. You pay it in failed requests that you have to retry over and over. You pay it in the accounts you ran through those dirty IPs that got flagged or banned, accounts that may have taken you real time and effort to build. And you pay it in the hours you spend debugging a problem you assumed was your code or your technique, when the whole time it was the proxy underneath everything. When you add all of that up, the bargain proxy is routinely the most expensive line in the whole operation. And the worst of those costs is the one that does not show up on any invoice. The trust you burn on the things you put behind the proxy. Think about an account you warmed up slowly. The careful first days, the patience it took to make it look real. You route it through a burned address shared with hundreds of other people, and the target ties your account to that bad neighborhood and takes it down. That warm-up time is gone, and so is whatever you were going to do with the account. So the only number that actually matters is not the price per gigabyte on the listing. It is the cost per surviving request, per surviving account, after the failures and the bans are counted. A proxy that is a tenth of the price but kills half your work is not cheap. It is the most expensive thing in the stack. That is the same lesson as the very first video on residential, just proven from the other direction. In that one, I was sat in front of the good providers asking which ones survive a real test. This is the same coin seen from the bottom of the market. Cheap residential is not a cheaper version of good residential. It is usually a different, broken product wearing the same word, and the savings are an illusion that you repay with interest and failures and bans. So how do you protect yourself? Because sometimes you do want to try a cheap option, and that is fine if you test it. Before you trust any proxy with real work, run the same quick checks I just described. Do an IP and ASIN lookup and confirm it is actually a consumer network, not a data center. Hit your real target with a small sample and watch the failure rate with your own eyes on the site you actually care about, not their demo. Check the same address twice to confirm you control the session. And keep your spend tiny until it has proven itself. Never load a big balance into a seller you have not verified. Let me make that checklist concrete so you can run it the moment you get access. Step 1. Take a handful of the addresses they give you and run each through a free IP type and ASIN lookup, and throw the whole thing out the second one of them comes back owned by a hosting company instead of a consumer network. Step 2. Take a small sample, not their demo, your real target, and watch the failure rate with your own eyes over a few dozen requests, because a wall of captchas in the first minute is your answer. Step 3. Recheck the same address after a short gap to confirm you actually hold a sticky session and the pool is not shuffling under you. Step 4. Keep your spend tiny, buy the smallest amount they will sell, and prove it on your own work before you ever load a real balance. The whole thing takes about 10 minutes and it saves you the entire disaster the rest of this video is about. And the bigger principle, the one that applies to every provider, including the expensive ones and including mine, is that you verify, you do not trust the listing. A good proxy passes these checks easily. A bad one fails them in minutes and the price tag tells you nothing on its own. The cheap listing fails because it has to, the maths guarantees it, but you should run the checks on everyone because a confident claim on a sales page is not evidence. Your own 10-minute test is, run it on the expensive names too, run it on the one I sell, because the only thing that ever proved the proxy to me was watching it pass my own test on my own target. If you want the providers that actually held up when I ran these checks, with the cheap traps flagged and the reasons spelled out, it is all at blackhatreview.org/best/proxies. And yes, I run a proxy operation myself, so I am biased, which is exactly why I am telling you to test mine the same way, because the test is the thing, not my word for it. Next up, I am tying the whole stack together, why multi-accounts actually get banned, how proxies, antidetect browsers, and cloud phones each close a different gap, and why fixing only one of them is why people still get caught. If that is useful, subscribe. There is one tested, honest review here every weekday. I will see you in the next one.